Hi, this is Morley, and this is the M-Wire. Well, folks, things are certainly hotting up between Russia and Ukraine. Let me give you a little bit of a backstory before I got sick. I was following this, but the meeting between Putin and Biden last Friday, I believe it was, basically started out with a gaffe as Biden forgot to turn on his mic. Well, that's not exactly surprising from somebody of the likes of Joe Biden. What essentially transpired from that meeting is basically Joe Biden threatening Vladimir Putin and Russia subsequently with a bunch of sanctions if they continue aggressive action, quote unquote, against the Ukraine. From what I could gather from Vladimir Putin's body language is he was less than amused with what Joe Biden had to say and didn't have a lot of reverence for it. He is absolutely adamant that NATO should not expand its membership east. He considers that a threat, and he made that abundantly clear to Joe Biden. Now, the United States has basically pledged arms and any supplies and whatnot for what may potentially be the war effort in Ukraine, but has stopped short of putting any American troops on the ground over there. Even after several months, he's still taking flack about how he handled Afghanistan and what a disaster that was. So I imagine somewhere in the recesses of his, so-called mind, he's a little gun-shy about actually getting troops involved because he's taken a lot of heat, as I say, for Afghanistan. That is very, very well documented. Apparently, after that meeting was over, Vladimir Putin sent another 10,000 troops to the Russia-Ukraine border. So that's how much he's listening to what the West has to say about NATO expansion. He distinctly has his own ideas about NATO expansion, and for all intents and purposes, he is adamant about refusing to let NATO expand east in any way, shape, or form. Obviously, he is referring to Ukraine in particular. Russia now has over 200,000 troops amassed on the Russian border, and even the Ukraine is confident that Russia will take over the country should they be so inclined, as per this headline here from the New York Times. Now, I'm not going to get into the specifics of this article, but I do have a couple of articles I'd like to share with you folks. These are especially good if you haven't been following this situation and you're a little behind as to where we're at. These two articles will completely bring you up to speed as to what's happening with Russia and Ukraine and the sheer severity of this situation. Without further ado, let's just dive right in. Now, this first article I'm going to get into is from The Guardian, and it discusses the intense military buildup on the Russian-Ukrainian border. Russia edges closer to war as new arms arrive on Ukraine's border. A recent sighting of Putin's notorious Buk missiles on their way to the front line does not bode well for talks. In case you're wondering what Buk missiles are, they're land-to-air mobile missiles. A flatbed rail wagon speeding through southwest Ukraine last week carried an ill omen for negotiations to avert a larger war with Ukraine. On board was a Buk M1, the kind of medium-range surface-to-air missile system that became notorious in 2014 after a missile fired from territory controlled by Russian proxies in eastern Ukraine shot down a Malaysian airliner, killing all 298 people aboard. If Russia goes to war in Ukraine, it still needs to take a number of steps: establishing fuel supply lines, opening field hospitals, and deploying air defense systems such as the Buk that would protect its heavy weaponry and troops near the front. Even as Joe Biden and Vladimir Putin were sitting down to talks meant to end the crisis, Russia was inching closer to being ready to launch a full-scale ground invasion of its neighbor. These data allow us to conclude that despite the negotiations between Biden and Putin, the concentration of Russian troops in the areas bordering the territory controlled by the Ukrainian authorities continues, wrote the Conflict Intelligence Team, an online research group that has used social media, railway schedules, and other data to reveal details of Russia's military buildup on the border. Putin may still decide not to launch an invasion as he leaves troops near the front as leverage for negotiations. But Russian and Western analysts are predicting that this military buildup, the second one this year, portends a series of future crises over Ukraine as Putin seeks to reverse its trajectory towards the West. Even if Putin gets something from the West, serious talks or discussions about guarantees, will that be enough for Putin, says Tatiana Stanova, founder of the political analysis Art Politique. We are witnessing the dawn of a new geopolitical adventurism from Russia. Despite the Putin-Biden talks, the crisis is growing deeper. On Thursday, Russia's FSB said it had intercepted a Ukrainian ship in the Sea of Azov near Crimea for failing to obey orders. A day later, Russia closed nearly 70% of the Sea of Azov, a shared body of water also used by Ukraine for firing drills. Then there is the escalating rhetoric. Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rabyov said Russia and the U.S. may be hurtling towards a repeat of the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, and Putin said that the situation in eastern Ukraine looked like genocide in a recent meeting, raising fears he could seek a pretext to send his troops into the country. With its military threat on the table, Russia's foreign ministry released its list of demands for how to end the crisis on Friday. Chief among them was for NATO to officially disavow the decision from the 2008 Bucharest NATO summit that Ukraine and Georgia will become NATO members. So as you can see, folks, Vladimir Putin is diametrically opposed to Ukraine and Georgia, for that matter, from becoming NATO members. And no, I'm not referring to Georgia in the United States. Georgia is another province in Eastern Europe. So it appears that Putin will not allow them to become NATO members. No way, no how. It's just not on as far as he is concerned. And it's interesting that he draws the parallel between what's happening now between Russia and Ukraine and the Cuban Missile Crisis. For those of you that are too young to remember, basically when JFK was president, Russia sent a small armada towards Cuba, including a nuclear-equipped submarine, and it was a very tense time in American history. Just ask anyone who's old enough to remember, and they'll tell you. You can certainly watch videos on YouTube here about it if you're interested. Putin spent the last 2 decades trying to fight NATO expansion, but the possible accession of Ukraine into the military alliance has always touched deeper emotions, and in part motivated him of the annexation of Crimea and provoke a war in eastern Ukraine that has killed more than 14,000 people. I told them, please don't touch Ukraine or there's going to be a problem, said Fyodor Lukyanov, an influential Russian foreign policy analyst, of his discussions with Western colleagues about NATO's enlargement in the 2000s. There is a real red line. Right or wrong, this kind of engagement with Ukraine on security and military affairs, this has been absolutely unacceptable. Lukyanov said Putin saw it as his duty as president not to leave the Ukrainian problem, meaning its trajectory towards the West, for the next Russian leader. The U.S. has sought to persuade Russia that Ukraine would not join the alliance anytime soon, but on Friday, Moscow demanded a more formal declaration. That was a non-starter. NATO head Jens Stoltenberg said within hours of the demand being made public, NATO's relationship with Ukraine is going to be decided by the 30 NATO allies and Ukraine, no one else, he said, during a press conference in Germany's new Chancellor Olaf Scholz. So as you can see, folks, both sides are completely obstinate about this. One side is saying, yes, we will decide who joins NATO, and Vladimir Putin is saying, not on my watch, you don't. And you get a sense that this is something that he wants to take care of, and obviously it's part of his legacy as the Russian leader, that he wants to settle this Ukraine thing once and for all. And if it means taking the country over, I personally think he's ready to do it. In Ukraine, support for joining NATO has jumped considerably in recent years. as the country has sought protection from an increasingly aggressive Russia, and for the nations on NATO's eastern flank, allowing Russia to dictate the alliance's policy on Ukraine is seen as the first step towards a slippery slope towards recognizing a Russian sphere of influence. History shows that pledges of neutrality by Ukraine or any other country in the region do nothing to abate Putin's appetite. Rather, they feed it, wrote Ukraine's Foreign Minister Dmytro Kuleba in an article published by Foreign Affairs on Friday. The best way to respond to such ultimatums is to ignore them altogether. There are doubts whether Russia really wants to strike any deal at all. Analysts noted that despite Moscow building up its forces for months, Russian diplomats had not prepared any formal documents or even formulated the country's demands until last week. And the idea of mustering nearly 100,000 troops within striking distance of the Ukrainian border, the U.S. has said that Russia could increase that number to 175,000 by the end of January, just to hold talks with Biden, has struck Western observers as overkill. That brings us back to the buck, which, as CIT noted, has its numbers crudely painted over in an effort to prevent identification. Russia employed similar tactics during its clandestine invasion of Ukraine in 2014. The clock is ticking. Putin could pull back, but that would be embarrassing to do so without a solid win in hand, and Russia's demands look impossible to fulfill for the West. Putin thinks that if Biden wants, he can move mountains and he can convince allies and convince Kiev to make concessions, said Stanovana. This problem could lead Putin to demand the impossible and push the stakes so high that everything ends in war. I personally think so, folks. I think that we're talking about Vladimir Putin's legacy here. He's not getting any younger. He wants to take care of this Ukraine problem, quote unquote. I don't think he's backing down this time, and it appears that NATO forces aren't backing down either. I want to get into this next article here, folks. I realize this video is getting a little long-winded, but I want you to understand the sheer severity of this situation. This isn't just, another military buildup. This one is absolutely different in a lot of ways. And this next article from the Jerusalem Post as of a day or two ago will greatly exemplify that. Russia said on Monday it may be forced to deploy intermediate-range nuclear missiles in Europe in response to what it sees as NATO's plans to do the same. The warning from Deputy Foreign Minister Sergei Rabyov raised the risk of new arms buildup on the continent, with East-West tensions at their worst since the Cold War ended 3 decades ago. Rabyov said that Russia would be forced to act if the West decided to join in a moratorium on intermediate-range nuclear forces in Europe, part of a package of security guarantees it is seeking as the price for defusing the crisis over Ukraine. So as you can see, folks, things are being ratcheted up here in terms of nuclear weapons. It is pretty scary when countries start moving nuclear weapons into position with a military buildup like this. It just obviously evokes fear. Progress towards a political and diplomatic solution would lead Russia to respond in a military way with military technology, Rabyov told Russia's RIA news agency. That is, it will be a confrontation. This will be the next round, he said, referring to the potential deployment of the missiles by Russia. So they're already talking about nuclear weapons here, folks, and they're talking about deploying them, as in firing them. Now, I realize a lot of this is saber-rattling, but when we think of nuclear war, we think of the entire world just being blown up, essentially. That's not necessarily how it could play out. It could play out more like a limited nuclear exchange a hypothetical situation is something like this. Putin decides to move on Ukraine. NATO tries to do something, and Putin initiates a nuclear strike on a small city in Europe as a deterrent. Now, that's just one scenario. It doesn't have to be all-out nuclear war where everybody fires everything at once as we envision in our minds, but it's worth noting that Russia not only has the most nuclear weapons, they also have the most sophisticated nuclear weapons at this time with the hypersonic missiles. Intermediate range nuclear weapons, those with a range of 500 to 5,500 kilometers, 310 to 3,400 miles, were banned in Europe under a 1987 treaty with then Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev and U.S. President Ronald Reagan, in what was hailed at the time as a major easing of Cold War tensions. By 1991, the two sides had destroyed nearly 2,700 of them. Washington withdrew from the pact in 2019 after complaining for years of alleged violations revolving around Russia's development of ground-launched cruise missiles that Moscow calls the 9M729 and NATO refers to as the screwdriver. If NATO is right that Russia has already deployed this system in the European part of the country west of the Ural Mountains, then Rabakov's threat is an empty one. According to Gerhard Mangot, an expert on Russian foreign policy and arms control at the University of Innsbruck in Austria. But if Russia's denials are true, he said, then Moscow's warning is the final signal to NATO that it should enter into talks with Russia about a freeze agreement. He added, if NATO sticks with the position not to negotiate about a deal, then we will certainly see Russia deploy the screwdriver missile at its very western border. Rabakov has emerged in recent days as one of Moscow's key messengers as President Vladimir Putin presses for Western security guarantees while facing warnings from the United States and its allies to back away from a possible invasion of Ukraine, something the minister again denies was Russia's intention. He repeated a comparison he made last week between the current tensions and the Cuban Missile Crisis of 1962, which brought the United States and Soviet Union to the brink of nuclear war. Ryabkov said there were indirect indications that NATO was moving closer to redeploying intermediate-range missiles, including its restoration last month of the 56th Artillery Command, which operated a nuclear-capable Pershing missiles during the Cold War. NATO says there will be no new U.S. missiles in Europe, and it is ready to deter new Russian missiles with a measured response that would only involve conventional weapons. But Ryabkov said that Russia had a complete lack of trust in the alliance. They don't permit themselves to do anything that could somehow increase our security. They believe they can act as they need to their advantage, and we simply have to swallow all this and continue with it. This is not going to continue. So as you can see, folks, both sides are obstinate against one another, and this situation is escalating. When they're talking about nuclear missiles already, and there hasn't even been a significant ground war, other than what's been happening over the past 6 or 7 years or so, this is a very serious situation, and I agree with the parallel that he drew about the Cuban Missile Crisis. This situation is getting more tense by the day. It's a matter of who blinks first, essentially, and I don't think that Vladimir Putin plans to blink at all. I know this update was a little on the lengthy side, but I wanted those that aren't really following this story to have a keen sense of where we're at with this situation. Like I say, it's getting more tense by the day. Neither side trusts each other, and this could very well end in war. But thank you so much for coming along with me to my update. Please remember to like, to comment, to share, and of course to subscribe. Until the next video, God bless.